Greetings, class, and welcome to Week 6 of BC3304 Biblical Counseling, Introduction to Biblical Counseling here at Arlington Baptist University. As always, we talk about the sufficiency of Scripture, progressive sanctification. In fact, next week, Week 7, is a 1-hour video dedicated to expounding upon that concept of progressive sanctification, so you'll be filled with biblical knowledge on that. And third, biblical instructions on how to grow and change. From the syllabus, here is all of the assignments and their value to your grade. That has not changed. And this is the schedule in a tabular form. We just finished turning in your midterm projects. I appreciate that. I've gotten those, haven't graded those. I have graded your first research papers though, so go look at the rubric. I put in lots of comments in each section with the feedback about why you got the grade that you did. All 3 papers were very good, but none of them were perfect, so there were no 100s. But so hopefully there's some things you can learn about research paper writing from what I've given you as feedback. Next week we will have our second quiz. The third quiz is immediately the following week, and then both the final exam and your final paper are due on March 8th, which is a Friday. Most everything's been due on Saturdays, except discussion boards, which of course are every Thursday. But on the last week, it is on a Friday, so the week is a day shorter for that deadline. Each week we do this short video to review last week's assignments, this week's assignments, and a sneak peek at next week's. We have something from J. Adams' nuthetic.blog/podcast every week. They're taken from his short 8 to 9 minute radio programs that he did in the 70s and 80s. Faith Baptist Church Palm Bay had a training center, which I was a part, and so we have a number of video lectures, 1 a week as a matter of fact, that come from there. And then other sources, as you've seen, some other primarily ACBC certified instructors and fellows. So last week was week 5. You were to listen to parts 9 and 10 out of a 12-part series that J. Adams did on how to counsel others. The key points from his 9th section were about data gathering, and so this lines up with what we're studying in the Biblical Counseling book by John MacArthur and the key elements that we're doing in the video series. And he talked specifically about data gathering, and in particular 3 questions that Jesus often asked, and that's why Jay modeled them that way. What is the problem? What have you already done to try to solve it? And what do you want me to do to help you? And he gave examples from Luke 18:41, John 1:31, and John 5:6, and Mark 10:35, where Christ interacted with people that came up to him in the streets while he was traveling from place to place. And that's how he asked very similar questions to those. And so we figure if Jesus did it that way, it would probably behoove us to learn from that. And so that's why we always ask those questions. They're part of the personal data inventory form that we asked for. I always ask them on my first phone call with them, those 3 questions. So, second was week number 10 out of 12, and J. Adams talked about the 3 levels of answers to that question, what is the problem? Some people answer it with a level of irritation, that they're tired, they're angry, they're bitter, they're depressed, etc. They're listing for you symptoms, or they're listing for you fruit on the tree. They're not addressing the root cause issues of those kinds of emotions or experiences that they're having. Then there is the casual level, and they may give you details about stories that are going on, timing of things that are happening for you to keep track of, problems that they're having interacting with other people, and they're telling you their side of the story of this bad interaction they're having with someone else. And then there is the possible answers, which really are the deepest rooted ones, that they are struggling with a pattern of life that they already recognize, and they're just having trouble getting that out of their life. And they're having similar problems now to what they've had in the past, and they know they need to change. They may even know what they need to change to. They're just having trouble doing it, and they want your help in holding them accountable, in teaching them, and giving them some techniques to apply biblical principles in their lives. So those counselees are a joy to counsel. They're already coming in with a humble heart, and they're already self-identifying that they have a problem that needs to be fixed. And I have many counselees that have come in that way, and much progress can be made when they're there. The other two are a little more difficult because you have to help them get from the fruit to the root. You have to help them get from the way they feel to the way they should think. And so that's why he goes through those three kinds of answers. So in the very first question you ask them, you have a good idea of what kind of person you have there and their willingness to change. Then you watched the first of two videos that cover 3 of 6 key elements of biblical counseling. First, we looked at building loving involvement, developing a relationship with your counselee. We are not the kind of counseling that you would tell your counselee, you know, if you see me in a restaurant, don't wave to me because then everybody will know you have problems and you're seeing the biblical counselor. No, you are a personal friend. You are a brother or sister in Christ. You are helping them become more Christ-like, admitting that you yourself are working on becoming more Christ-like, that you don't have all the answers or have everything figured out, but you're a fellow believer on the progressive sanctification journey, learning to be more Christ-like, helping them do the same. And you are looking to build relationships that are based on truth and grace. You are there to be a spiritual friend and to emphasize that grace and that suffering that we all have because we live in a fallen world that's filled with sin. That's not our fault. We inherited it from Adam. And we live in a world filled with sin that is our fault because our hearts are desperately wicked and on a journey trying to learn how to be more Christ-like. So in addition to relationships, building loving involvement, the second one was sharing biblical hope. Make sure in every session, but especially in the first session, that you cast some hope for them that they can change. In this, we talked about the story of Joseph and how he changed over time from Genesis 39 to Genesis 50 as a young man to a senior statesman in Egypt. We talked about how God is faithful. 1 Corinthians 10:13 is a very frequently used verse that I assign to counselees to memorize so that they know that there is no temptation or trial that isn't common to man. Lots of people have been through it. And God is faithful, who will provide for you a way to escape. So just knowing that alone builds hope. And we talked about how important it is not to be manipulated by tears or rambling or blaming. There's that proverb in Proverbs 18 that says, a story seems right until you hear the other side. So always realize when you're listening to the answer to that first question, what's the problem? You're hearing one side of a story that may or may not be exactly accurate. And then we talked about in the video making sure you use biblical terminology. We live in such a psychologized world that has invented new words for biblical terms. New words like addiction for life-dominating sin. New words like orthogonal defiance, which is basically disobedience. So when you're discussing things with people, they may use modern jargon, and you may use it in an attempt to explain it in biblical terms, help them translate from modern words to biblical terms, also that they can see the Bible has answers for these very things. Then, in addition to relationships and building and sharing hope, gather relevant data. A lot of questions get asked, intrinsic questions, extrinsic questions. It is important to to not speak a lot. Ask the question and let them talk, and listen to what they have to say. Proverbs 18:13 says it is a fool who jumps to a conclusion before he's heard the entire matter. And then second, make sure you hear both sides of the story, especially if you're in marriage counseling and you've got the husband and the wife sitting there in front of you. Proverbs 18:17 is one I referred to earlier, is that it is seems right what someone says until you hear the other side. And there were some good examples that we gave of that in the video. And then knowing what kinds of questions to ask. There's core questions that are just facts. There's extensive questions, which are kind of general questions about their life. And then there's intensive questions that are specific about a situation they've described to you. And then there's always halo data. Watching the body language of the one that's not talking as they react with heavy sighs or crossing their legs or rolling their eyes and that sort of thing. If you have an opportunity to counsel with someone else, often husbands and wives counsel together, the one who's not doing the teaching and the asking and the taking notes and signing homework can often be of great help by seeing halo data that the other person doesn't see. So it's very important. Then you read in the counseling book by MacArthur. These chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11 was quite a bit to read this week. And these were written by Wayne Mack, who is a very seasoned, experienced biblical counselor, which John MacArthur is a lot of things, but he is not that. He's a wonderful theologian, and he pulled this whole book together, but he wisely relied on someone with lots of counseling experience to go through the teaching of these four principles of involvement, showing compassion as if they were a family member, which they are, as a brother or sister in Christ, to build hope, help them distinguish between false hope and true hope. Don't let them get away with words like I can't. In fact, whenever someone says I can't, when you're talking to them about change, what they really are saying, I won't or I don't. Because sinful behavior is learned behavior, which means it can be unlearned. I'm not saying it's easy, but it can be done, so don't let them get away with I can't. Or language that shifts the blame. My wife makes me mad. No, you're the one choosing to get mad. And then the one that I hear the most and is really frustrating is we've tried that biblical principle and it just doesn't work. That is a foolish thing to say for obvious reasons if you believe in the sufficiency of Scripture, but it also is an indicator that you tried something for a little while and didn't see what you wanted to change to happen, which is often the wrong goal. You implement biblical principles in your life as you interact with another person to make sure you are pleasing God by doing what you are supposed to do. The other person may or may not change. That may or may not get fixed. That's not the goal of living a godly life. Godly life is to please that audience of one. So when you say something doesn't work because your kids didn't change their behavior or your husband still yells at you when he's mad, does not mean that the principles are wrong and you're the one exception that they don't apply to. So that's something you may have to teach over and over with many a counselee. Then chapter 10 was about collecting data, physical data, like what their sleep habits are like. Often their sleep habits are contributing to the problem. What their diet is like, what their exercise is like. Have they had any illnesses? Are they on any medications? It's not that you're a doctor and you're not going to be violating HIPAA requirements by asking these kinds of questions. They can always say it's none of your business if there's something particularly personal they don't want to talk about. But these are often contributing factors, and you may have some suggestions of things they should ask their doctor as they think about those 5 areas of their physical health. Also collect data on various resources that they make available to you, the emotions they describe, the actions they've told you that they take, the concepts that they believe life is built upon, and the history that they have with each other or other people that are outside the counseling room that they have relationships with. And we have developed a personal data inventory form. There's a lot of these on the internet that you can download, and they have open questions. And there's a PDF version in the John MacArthur book that Wayne Mack used at that time when he wrote it. And then, of course, he goes over halo data as well, just like we did in the video. Key points from chapters 8, 9, 10, 11. We're up to chapter 11 now, interpreting that data. So you've gathered all this data. How do you interpret it? Is this person saved or unsaved? Do I need to turn it into evangelism mode to make sure they understand the gospel and how it works? Are they a mature believer or are they rather immature? Are they being unruly, in which I need to come at this a different way? Are they faint-hearted? Are they weak? 1 Thessalonians 5:14 addresses all these. He says, "Now we exhort you, brethren, warn them that are unruly." That's what the unruly person needs. Comfort those that are feeble-minded. Support those that are weak. And then be patient with all men, no matter which of those three categories it is. Patience is often very much needed by the counselor. And then interpreting the problems that they describe to you, the conflicts they have with other people, instability they have in their performance or in their relationships, lying. Lying is very common, so learn to identify it. Confusion that they may have. They may have misinterpreted a biblical principle and how to do it, or misinterpreted a fact about their spouse or about their friend. They've jumped to a wrong conclusion, and you see it, and they, before they do. Or are they living in fear or insecurity? Are they exhibiting some kind of bizarre behavior? Do they have worry? That is one of the things Jesus told us not to do. And yet it's one of those acceptable sins that we use all the time. I'm worried about my son-in-law. I'm worried about my investments. I'm worried about the country falling apart. We worry when Jesus told us not to. We've got studies on that, so they make good homework assignments. Also judgmentalism. Are they the kind of proud person that sees other people's problems as logs and their own problems as little specks that don't need to be taken care of, which is the opposite of what God has taught us to do, to be a humble person. You see problems in your life as logs and want to work hard to get them out. And you see problems in other people's lives as specks that don't require your prognostication and judgment to inform someone of the sin in their life. So see if you see some of that behavior. It's quite common. Then we read chapter 8 in Instruments in Redeemer's Hands by Paul Tripp. He talked about the relationships, again, by identifying with suffering, making sure you have a good understanding theologically. These are deep subjects of God's sovereignty, of His goodness, of His purpose in our lives, of the reasons that He uses us as instruments in His hands so that He may be made perfect and be able to comfort people when they are suffering, to show compassion, and share a little bit about your story, not a lot, but a little so that they know you've been through some things too and you can identify with them. Paul talked about a completed story that has the problem, the struggle, how God helped you. So don't just tell a story to say, yeah, I feel the same way. I had a lousy childhood too, but rather only tell stories that show that progression, because in building that camaraderie and that compassion and that relationship, you're also delivering hope because your story has a hopeful ending to it. Include worship. The ACBC podcast this week is talking about the doxologization of biblical counseling. That counseling is already a form of worship, but you need to think of it that way as a biblical counselor. And Paul Tripp talked about that in this chapter as well. All of our suffering belongs to God. That's a stewardship issue. God owns everything, including our debts, including our suffering. Even though some of those things are our fault, God's still in charge of them all. And Paul talks about how fallen our world is and how much in need it is of a hopeful message to be delivered through Christ-centered stories that reach the heart. So that brings us to week 6. You have journaling to do on chapters 12, 13, and 14 in John MacArthur's book, and chapters 9 and 10 in Paul Tripp's book. These are all going to be dealing with additional key elements of biblical counseling. We will finally finish the series on how to counsel people by Jay Adams. Parts 11 and 12 will complete that. Then you'll be watching the key elements 4, 5, and 6 video, participating in discussion board number 6. You have a research paper that's due at the end of week 8, it should say, so I need to fix that typo. And there's quiz number 2 this week. It'll be based on weeks 3 and 4 lectures, and then quiz 3 will be based on 5 and 6. So chapter 12 through 14 are about instruction and motivation in the counseling room. Chapters 9 and 10 are about knowing and discovering needed change in your counselees. And then you'll be listening to how to counsel others, wrapping that up. And for the video, we'll be going over discernment, instruction or teaching, and homework. So journal on all these things. So I'm expecting 4 different entries in your journal, each of which will be worth 25%. Here are the links to the key elements 4 through 6, and I went ahead and threw in the links for next week's video on progressive sanctification. More about that next week. Discussion board, based on your listening to parts 11 and 12 of Jay Adams' How to Counsel Others, what are some examples of questions you might ask in counseling that you might not in normal conversation? And why is homework so important in biblical counseling? And then based on reading chapters 9 and 10 in Paul Tripp's book, Instruments of Redeemer's Hands, discuss the importance of asking good open-ended questions in counseling and how to biblically organize the data that you as a counselor will collect. So the paper number 2 is due March the 7th, not May, or the 8th rather. It's a 5-page research paper on your findings on a biblical counseling research topic of your choosing. So I'm just now introducing this to you, but it's not due for a few weeks. This is week 6. It's due at the end of week 8. You may get the bibliography for at least one book source and find another scholarly or empirically sound resource for a total of 5 resources that contribute to your paper. Example topics may be depression or shame, anxiety, anger, lust, grief, worry, life-dominating sins or addictions. The outline should follow the rubric. Thank you for those of you that did that. Not all of you did, but when you have your paper, I'd like you to write the topic from the rubric so I can see where you're writing to fulfill that need in the rubric. And it should be an introduction, which includes a thesis statement, the problem experience, the biblical considerations, and how you're speaking the gospel, and a conclusion. A good example thesis statement reads like this. Depression is usually experienced as, and then you go through the key points in section 1, and should be understood biblically as, and go through the key points in section 2. And those who want help to help people that are struggling with depression should, and then you go through the section 3 points that you made. This is, again, summarized in Jeremy Pierre's guidance on research papers. Take another look at it. It's a short read. It's worth it. This is the rubric. I'm not going to walk through all of it now, but it is the important thing. This is your outline for your paper, which makes it easier for me to grade. All of you need to work a little bit on your grammar. You had some grammar spelling issues in your paper. I pointed those out to you. Next week, we'll be reading John MacArthur's book, chapter 15, 16, and 17, and Paul Tripp's book, chapters 11 through 14. I have a special treat from Jay Adams, his last public speaking engagement, which I happened to attend, where he went through his very first book. It's a 1-hour talk on competent to counsel out of Romans 14 and 15. and you'll be watching a video on progressive sanctification, the discussion board number 7, and quiz number 3. God bless you as you finish up week 6. We're getting to be about 3/4 of the way done with the class. As always, text or email if you need help.